Welcome, weary soul, to this quiet space of biblical history. Before we journey back to one of the most dramatic and sobering stories in all of Scripture, I want to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're nestled under the covers, ready to drift off to sleep, or simply looking to unwind with some quiet biblical storytelling, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a delight to see the diverse community of believers and curious souls gathered here. And if you enjoy this style of calm, immersive tales from Scripture, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss the next installment. But for now, let's allow the stresses of the modern world to melt away as we travel back to a time long ago when the very ground trembled beneath the weight of divine judgment. A time when fire and brimstone rained from heaven itself, consuming cities that had grown so corrupt, so twisted in their ways, that even the mercy of the Almighty could no longer shield them from destruction. Picture yourself standing on the dusty plains of ancient Canaan, where the sun beats down mercilessly and the horizon shimmers with heat. In the distance, nestled in the fertile Jordan Valley, lie two cities that gleam like jewels against the desert landscape. These are Sodom and Gomorrah, along with their sister cities, Admah and Zeboim. From a distance, they appear prosperous, their walls rising proudly from the earth, their gates bustling with merchants and travelers from distant lands. But beneath this veneer of civilization and wealth, something dark and twisted has taken root. The cities that once might have been beacons of human achievement have become places where the very fabric of moral order has been torn asunder, where the cries of the innocent rise like smoke to the heavens, and where the presence of God Himself has become unwelcome. This is not merely a story of divine wrath, though wrath there certainly was. It is a story of justice and mercy intertwined, of a God who grieves over the corruption of His creation, yet cannot allow wickedness to flourish unchecked. It is a story that echoes through the ages, reminding us that even in our modern world, the principles of righteousness and justice remain as relevant as ever. The tale begins, as so many biblical narratives do, with a journey. Abraham, that great patriarch of faith, has pitched his tent near the oaks of Mamre. The heat of the day is beginning to wane when three mysterious visitors approach his dwelling. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was not merely a courtesy, but a sacred duty, and Abraham rushes to welcome these strangers with the kind of lavish generosity that would make even kings take notice. But these are no ordinary travelers. As the story unfolds, we come to understand that Abraham is hosting the Lord Himself, accompanied by two angels. What begins as an act of simple hospitality becomes something far more profound, a divine consultation about the fate of entire cities. As the visitors prepare to depart, the Lord reveals His purpose. He has heard a cry, a terrible outcry that has reached the very throne of heaven. It is the voice of injustice, of oppression, of sins so grievous that they demand investigation. Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, the Lord declares. I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. Now here we must pause and consider something remarkable about the character of God, as revealed in this ancient text. This is not a deity who acts in haste or anger, but one who investigates before passing judgment. The all-knowing God chooses to go down and see, not because His knowledge is limited, but because His justice is perfect. Every action must be weighed, every cry for justice must be heard, every opportunity for repentance must be offered. And it is here that we witness one of the most extraordinary conversations in all of Scripture. As the two angels continue towards Sodom, Abraham finds himself alone with the Almighty, and what follows is nothing short of astounding. This desert nomad, this man of simple faith, begins to negotiate with God himself for the lives of the righteous who might dwell within those doomed cities. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Abraham asks, his voice carrying the weight of moral urgency. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? What follows is a masterclass in divine mercy and human intercession. Step by step, number by number, Abraham negotiates downward. 50 righteous souls. 45, 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. 10 righteous people would be enough to spare these great cities from destruction. The God of justice reveals himself to be also the God of mercy, willing to spare the many for the sake of the few. But as the angels enter Sodom that evening, the true nature of these cities begins to reveal itself. They are welcomed by Lot, Abraham's nephew, who has made his home within these walls. Lot, like his uncle, understands the sacred duty of hospitality and insists that these strangers stay in his house rather than spend the night in the town square. His insistence, we soon realize, is born not merely from courtesy, but from a desperate understanding of the dangers that lurk in the shadows of Sodom's streets. As night falls and the household prepares for rest, the true character of Sodom is unveiled in all its horror. The men of the city, both young and old, surround Lot's house. Their intentions are clear and devastating. They demand that the visitors be brought out so that they might abuse and violate them. This is not merely individual wickedness, but societal corruption, so complete that it has infected every level of the community. Lot's response reveals both his understanding of hospitality's sacred nature and the tragic depths to which these cities have fallen. In desperation, he even offers his own daughters to the mob, so committed is he to protecting his guests. But the crowd will not be deterred. They have come for the strangers, and they will have them. It is then that the divine nature of the visitors is revealed. The angels strike the mob with blindness, leaving them groping helplessly in the darkness, unable to find even the door they had been pounding upon moments before. The judgment has begun, but even now, mercy lingers. The angels urge Lot to gather his family and flee. Get up, they say. Take your wife and your 2 daughters, who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But even faced with such clear divine warning, human nature reveals its tragic inertia. Lot's sons-in-law think he is jesting. The idea of divine judgment seems impossible to them, perhaps because they have grown so accustomed to evil that they cannot imagine a world where righteousness demands action. When morning comes, Lot himself lingers, perhaps unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what is about to unfold. The angels must literally take Lot, his wife, and his daughters by the hand and drag them from the city. Even then, their instructions are specific and urgent. Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills lest you be swept away. As the sun rises over the Jordan Valley on what will be the last morning these cities will ever see, the sky itself seems to crack open. Fire and sulfur rain down from heaven with a fury that defies description. The very elements seem to rebel against the corruption that has taken root in this place. The destruction is not merely physical, but cosmic, a divine reset that wipes these centers of wickedness from the face of the earth. The Hebrew text uses words that paint a picture of utter devastation. The cities are overthrown, a term that suggests not just destruction but complete reversal, as if the very foundations of the earth have been turned upside down. Smoke rises from the ruins like the smoke of a great furnace, visible from far across the desert as a testament to the thoroughness of divine justice. But even in this moment as we settle deeper into this ancient story, let us turn our attention to the profound question of divine justice and human responsibility that emerges from the ashes of Sodom and Gomorrah. The destruction we've witnessed was not merely an act of divine wrath, but a carefully measured response to a society that had lost its way completely. The biblical account tells us that the sins of these cities were not limited to what we might initially assume. Yes, there was sexual immorality, but the scriptures reveal a much broader picture of moral decay. In Ezekiel chapter 16, we find a detailed description of Sodom's true transgressions. The prophet writes that Sodom's sin was pride, abundance of food, and prosperous ease, but she did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. They were haughty and committed abomination before the Lord. This reveals something profound about the nature of divine judgment. It wasn't just about individual acts of wickedness, but about the complete breakdown of social justice, compassion, and human dignity. These cities had become places where the vulnerable were exploited, where hospitality was replaced with hostility, and where the basic covenant of human community had been shattered. The concept of hospitality in the ancient Near East was sacred. When strangers came to your city, you were bound by both custom and divine law to protect them. Yet in Sodom, the very opposite occurred. The men of the city surrounded Lot's house, demanding that he surrender his guests to their violence. This wasn't merely inhospitality, it was a complete inversion of the moral order that God had established for human society. As we reflect on Abraham's intercession, we see a beautiful picture of the righteous pleading for the wicked. Abraham's prayers reveal the heart of a man who understood that mercy and justice must work together in God's character. He asked whether God would destroy the righteous with the wicked, and in doing so, he was wrestling with one of the most fundamental questions of human existence. How can a loving God allow judgment to fall? The answer lies in understanding that God's justice is not separate from his love, but rather an expression of it. Just as a loving parent must sometimes discipline a child to prevent greater harm, so God's judgment serves to protect the innocent and preserve righteousness in the world. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not arbitrary, but necessary to prevent the complete corruption of human society. Consider the progression of events that led to this moment. God had already shown tremendous patience with these cities. The cry of their sins had come up before him, suggesting that their wickedness had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Yet even then, God sent messengers to investigate, to verify the reports, and to offer one final opportunity for repentance. The angels who visited Lot were not merely harbingers of doom, but agents of divine mercy. Their presence in the city was itself an act of grace, offering Lot and his family a chance to escape the coming judgment. Even in the midst of executing justice, God was providing a way of salvation for those who would receive it. This pattern of judgment mingled with mercy runs throughout the biblical narrative. We see it in the flood account, where Noah and his family were preserved. We see it in the plagues of Egypt, where the Israelites were protected while judgment fell on their oppressors. And we see it supremely in the cross of Christ, where God's justice and mercy meet in perfect harmony. The story of Lot's wife turning to look back has captivated readers for millennia. What drove her to disobey the clear command of the angels? Perhaps it was mere curiosity, or perhaps it was something deeper. The cities burning behind them represented not just destruction, but the end of a way of life. Everything familiar, everything comfortable, was being consumed by divine fire. Her backward glance might represent the human tendency to cling to the familiar, even when it's destructive. How often do we find ourselves looking back to patterns of life that we know are harmful, simply because they're what we know? Her transformation into a pillar of salt serves as a stark reminder that there are moments in life when we must choose between the past and the future, between destruction and salvation, and that hesitation can be fatal. The theological implications of this account have been debated by scholars for centuries. Some see it as a literal historical event, while others interpret it symbolically. But perhaps the most important question is not whether it happened exactly as described, but what it teaches us about the nature of God, the reality of sin, and the hope of redemption. The New Testament writers certainly saw significance in this account. Jesus himself referred to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as a warning about the reality of divine judgment. In Luke chapter 17, he said that, as it was in the days of Lot, people were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Peter also draws lessons from this account, writing in his second epistle that God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. Yet he also notes that God rescued righteous Lot, who was distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. This reminds us that God's judgment is always discriminating, always just, and always tempered with mercy for those who seek him. The account also raises profound questions about collective versus individual responsibility. Were there truly no righteous people in these cities besides Lot's family? Abraham's negotiation with God suggests that even 10 righteous people might have been enough to spare the cities entirely. This speaks to the powerful influence that righteousness can have in society, and conversely, to the devastating effects when that moral influence is completely absent. As we consider these ancient events, we might ask ourselves what lessons they hold for our own time. What are the characteristics of a society that invites divine judgment? Pride, abundance coupled with indifference to the poor, the breakdown of basic human decency, the perversion of justice, and the abandonment of the fundamental moral principles that make civilization possible. Yet, even in this sobering account, we find hope. God's willingness to spare the cities for the sake of even a few righteous people reminds us of the power of individual faithfulness. Like Abraham interceding for Sodom, we too are called to stand in the gap, to pray for our communities, and to be agents of righteousness in a world that often seems bent on destruction. The story also reminds us that God's timing is perfect. He doesn't act hastily in judgment, but neither does he delay beyond the appointed time. There comes a moment when mercy must give way to justice, when patience must yield to action, when the cup of wrath is finally full and must be poured out. As we prepare to rest, let these ancient truths settle into our hearts like gentle rain. Remember that the same God who judged Sodom and Gomorrah is the God who provided escape for Lot, who heard Abraham's prayers, and who continues to show mercy to all who call upon his name. In a world that often seems chaotic and unjust, we can rest in the knowledge that God sees all, knows all, and will ultimately make all things right. Let the destruction of these ancient cities remind you not of a God eager to condemn, but of a God so holy that sin cannot stand in his presence, yet so loving that he provides ways of escape for all who will receive them. Like Lot fleeing the burning cities, we too are called to leave behind the things that would destroy us and to run toward the safety that God provides. And so, as you drift towards sleep, carry with you the assurance that the God who preserved righteous Lot, who heard Abraham's intercession, and who showed mercy even in the midst of judgment, is the same God who watches over you tonight. Rest in his perfect justice, trust in his unfailing mercy, and wake tomorrow with a heart ready to live righteously in whatever city or circumstance he has placed you. As the morning sun cast its first golden rays across the ancient landscape, the reality of divine judgment began to settle into the consciousness of those who witnessed it. The twin cities that had once bustled with commerce and activity now lay beneath a veil of smoke and ash, their proud towers reduced to rubble, their streets silent forever. Yet even in this moment of terrible finality, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah continued to unfold, revealing deeper truths about the nature of justice, mercy, and the consequences of moral decay. In the aftermath of destruction, we find ourselves drawn not just to the spectacular nature of the judgment itself, but to the quieter, more profound questions it raises about human nature and divine character. For you see, the tale of these cities is not merely a historical account of ancient urban centres meeting their doom. It is a mirror held up to every generation, reflecting back our own struggles with pride, indifference, and the gradual erosion of moral foundations that can occur when a society loses its way. As we settle deeper into this exploration, let us consider the aftermath and its meaning. Lot and his daughters, having escaped the conflagration, found themselves alone in a cave in the mountains. The man who had once sat in the gates of Sodom, who had accumulated wealth and status in that prosperous city, now possessed nothing but his life and the lives of his children. It was a stark reminder that material prosperity, no matter how abundant, cannot shield us from the consequences of moral compromise. The daughters of Lot, traumatized by the destruction they had witnessed and believing themselves to be the last people on earth, made decisions that would echo through generations. Their actions, born of desperation and misunderstanding, led to the founding of the Moabite and Ammonite peoples, nations that would later become thorns in the side of Israel. Even in survival, the legacy of Sodom's corruption continued to ripple outward through time. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the aftermath was not what was destroyed, but what was preserved. Archaeological evidence suggests that the region where these cities once stood became a wasteland, a place of salt and sulfur where nothing would grow. The Dead Sea, that body of water so dense with minerals that nothing can live in its depths, serves as an eternal monument to this ancient judgment. Travelers for millennia have gazed upon its shores and remembered the price of moral bankruptcy. The preservation of this desolate landscape serves a purpose beyond mere historical record. It stands as a testament to the reality of divine justice, a physical reminder that actions have consequences, and that even the mightiest cities cannot escape the moral laws that govern the universe. The salt-encrusted shores whisper to every generation the same warning, that prosperity without righteousness is a hollow achievement, destined for collapse. Yet even as we contemplate the severity of the judgment, we must not lose sight of the mercy that preceded it. The angels who came to warn Lot were not harbingers of arbitrary destruction, but messengers of grace, offering escape to any who would heed their warning. The fact that God was willing to spare the entire cities for the sake of even 10 righteous people reveals a heart that takes no pleasure in judgment, but rather seeks every opportunity for redemption. This divine reluctance to judge is perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of the entire narrative. The God who rained fire and brimstone upon these cities is the same God who lingered in conversation with Abraham, who listened patiently to the patriarch's increasingly bold requests for mercy. The judgment that fell was not the result of divine anger finally boiling over, but rather the inevitable consequence of a people who had systematically rejected every opportunity for repentance and reform. The citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah had been given time, years, perhaps decades, to recognize their moral drift and correct course. They had witnessed the righteousness of Lot, imperfect though he was, living among them. They had encountered angels of God face to face, though they responded with violence rather than reverence. Every sunrise had been another opportunity for repentance. Every sunset, another day of squandered grace. This patience of divine justice teaches us something profound about the nature of moral accountability. Judgment does not fall suddenly and without warning upon individuals or societies. Rather, it comes as the final chapter in a long story of rejected grace, spurned warnings, and hardened hearts. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not an act of divine caprice, but the inevitable result of a people who had chosen their path deliberately and persistently. As we reflect on these ancient events from our modern vantage point, we might ask ourselves what lessons they hold for our own time. The sins that characterize these cities, pride, neglect of the poor, sexual immorality, violence towards strangers, are not foreign to our contemporary world. The patterns of moral decay that led to their downfall can be observed in societies throughout history, including our own. The progression is often remarkably similar. It begins with prosperity and comfort, leading to pride and self-sufficiency. This pride manifests in a turning away from God and from concern for others, particularly the vulnerable. Sexual morality becomes fluid, defined by desire rather than divine design. Hospitality gives way to hostility, especially toward those who are different or who challenge prevailing attitudes. Justice becomes perverted, with the powerful exploiting the weak while claiming righteousness for themselves. Yet, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah also offers hope. It reminds us that God's justice, while certain, is also patient. It shows us that even in the midst of widespread moral decay, righteousness is still possible. Lot, for all his flaws, was still considered righteous enough to save. It demonstrates that God's mercy extends even to the undeserving, offering escape routes and second chances to those who will take them. The account also reveals the power of intercessory prayer. Abraham's bold conversation with God shows us that the prayers of the righteous can have real impact on divine decisions. While Abraham was ultimately unable to save the cities due to the lack of righteous people within them, his intercession demonstrates a principle that remains true today: that prayer can move the heart of God and alter the course of events. This intercessory aspect of the story takes on even greater significance when we consider it in light of the broader biblical narrative. Abraham's plea for mercy on behalf of cities that had shown him no particular kindness prefigures the ultimate intercession of Christ, who would pray for forgiveness even for those who crucified him. The patriarch's willingness to stand in the gap for the unrighteous reflects the heart of God himself, who desires that none should perish, but that all should come to repentance. The story also illuminates the communal nature of both sin and salvation. The wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah was not merely the sum of individual transgressions, but a cultural phenomenon that had infected the entire social fabric. Similarly, righteousness has a communal dimension. Had there been even 10 righteous people in the cities, their presence would have been sufficient to preserve the entire population. This communal aspect challenges our modern tendency toward individualism. We are not isolated moral agents whose choices affect only ourselves. Rather, we are part of communities, families, and societies whose moral health depends in part on our own faithfulness. The righteous serve as salt and light, preserving and illuminating their communities. When that preserving influence is removed or diminished, decay inevitably follows. The fate of Lot's wife, transformed into a pillar of salt for looking back at the burning cities, serves as a poignant reminder of the danger of divided loyalties. She had been rescued from judgment, delivered from destruction, yet her heart remained attached to what she was leaving behind. Her backward glance was not mere curiosity, but a symbol of spiritual regression, a turning away from salvation toward the very thing from which she had been saved. This detail in the narrative speaks to the ongoing struggle that faces everyone who seeks to live righteously in an unrighteous world. The temptation to look back, to long for the apparent pleasures and freedoms of a life lived without moral constraints, is constant and powerful. Yet the story warns us that salvation requires not just escape from judgment, but a wholehearted embrace of the new life being offered. The transformation of Lot's wife into salt is particularly significant given the role of salt in preservation and purification. She became a permanent monument to the choice she made, a warning to future generations about the consequences of spiritual compromise. Her fate reminds us that neutrality is not an option when it comes to ultimate questions of righteousness and judgment. As night falls over our contemplation of these ancient events, we are left with sobering questions about our own time and our own choices. The prosperity and comfort that many enjoy today mirror in many ways the abundance that characterized Sodom and Gomorrah before their fall. The moral issues that plagued those ancient cities, sexual immorality, neglect of the poor, pride, inhospitality, and injustice, remain pressing concerns in our contemporary world. Yet the story also offers profound hope. It reminds us that God's character remains unchanged. He is still patient, still merciful, still willing to spare the unrighteous for the sake of the righteous. The same God who walked in the cool of the evening with Adam, who wrestled with Jacob, who spoke face to face with Moses, continues to seek relationship with humanity today. His desire is not for judgment, but for repentance, not for destruction, but for restoration. The account of Sodom and Gomorrah ultimately points us toward the greatest expression of divine mercy in human history, the coming of Christ. Where these ancient cities fell under judgment because no sufficient righteousness could be found within them, Jesus came as the perfectly righteous one who could stand in the gap for all humanity. Where Lot's righteousness was imperfect and incomplete, Christ's righteousness was perfect and complete. The fire and brimstone that fell upon these cities prefigures the final judgment that awaits all who persist in rebellion against God. Yet, for those who turn to Christ, that judgment has already fallen, not upon them, but upon their substitute. The same divine justice that demanded the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was satisfied at Calvary, where the righteous one died for the unrighteous. As we close this chapter of our journey through the biblical narrative, let us carry with us both the warning and the hope that these ancient events provide. The warning reminds us that moral choices have consequences, that societies as well as individuals are accountable to divine justice, and that prosperity without righteousness is a fragile and temporary thing. The hope reminds us that mercy triumphs over judgment for those who will receive it, that God's patience endures far longer than we deserve, and that even in the midst of widespread moral decay, individual righteousness is still possible and still matters. The same God who would have spared Sodom for 10 righteous people is still at work in our world today, seeking those who will stand in the gap, who will be salt and light in their communities, who will intercede for the lost and the wayward. May we learn from the example of Abraham, who dared to approach the throne of grace with bold requests for mercy. May we avoid the example of Lot's wife, whose divided heart led to her destruction. And may we remember that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, while ancient, speaks with contemporary relevance to every generation that must choose between righteousness and rebellion, between the temporary pleasures of sin and the eternal joy of fellowship with God. In the quietness of this moment, as we reflect on these timeless truths, we are reminded that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remains the same yesterday, today, and forever. His justice is perfect, His mercy is abundant, and His love endures for all who will receive it. The flames that consumed the cities of the plain have long since died away, but the lessons they teach burn as brightly as ever, illuminating the path of wisdom for all who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Sleep well, knowing that the same divine love that sought to preserve even the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of a few righteous people continues to watch over you tonight. Rest in the assurance that mercy triumphs over judgment, that grace abounds where sin once reigned, and that the morning light will dawn with fresh opportunities to walk in righteousness and to be a blessing to the world around you. As the first light of dawn crept across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah lay wrapped in an uneasy silence. The night had been long and restless, filled with the echoes of voices raised in anger and the sound of fists pounding against ancient doors. Yet now, in these precious moments before the sun fully claimed the sky, there was a stillness that seemed almost sacred, as if creation itself was holding its breath. Abraham stood upon a hilltop overlooking the Jordan Valley, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed upon the distant cities that sprawled like dark stains across the fertile plain below. The morning breeze carried with it the scent of smoke and something else, something that made his heart heavy with foreboding. He had spent the night in fervent prayer, wrestling with the divine like Jacob at the Jabbok, pleading for mercy upon the cities where his nephew Lot had chosen to make his home. The conversation with the Lord still rang fresh in his memory, each word carved into his consciousness, like commandments upon stone. "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" he had asked, and in that question lay the weight of all human longing for justice tempered with mercy, for righteousness that did not forget compassion. The Lord had listened, had agreed to spare the cities if even 10 righteous souls could be found within their walls. 10 souls. Such a small number, yet as Abraham gazed upon the awakening cities below, he wondered if even that modest remnant existed. The sun climbed higher, its rays beginning to burn away the morning mist that clung to the valley floor like a shroud. As the haze cleared, the true scope of the city's corruption became visible even from this distance. Smoke rose not from cooking fires or forge flames, but from places where it should not rise. The very air seemed to shimmer with an unnatural heat, as if the earth itself was fevered with the sickness that had taken root in human hearts. In the streets of Sodom, the morning brought no peace, no respite from the chaos that had consumed the night. The men who had surrounded Lot's house had not simply dispersed with the dawn. They had scattered like wounded animals, carrying their rage and frustration into every corner of the city. What had begun as a demand for the strangers had transformed into something far more sinister, a crystallization of every dark impulse that had been festering in the city's soul. The merchants who opened their stalls in the marketplace did so with suspicious glances and trembling hands. Trust, that fragile thread that binds communities together, had finally snapped. Neighbors eyed neighbors with newfound wariness, wondering who among them might be next to face the mob's attention. Children huddled close to their parents, sensing in the very air that something fundamental had shifted, that the world they had known was crumbling around them like a house built upon sand. Yet even in this darkness, there were those who recognized the gravity of what was unfolding. In quiet corners and hidden chambers, a few souls gathered to pray, to weep, to ask forgiveness for their city's sins. These were the ones who had not bowed the knee to the idols of pleasure and power, who had maintained some flicker of conscience despite the overwhelming tide of corruption that surrounded them. They were few, heartbreakingly few, but they were there, scattered like seeds of righteousness in barren ground. Among these was an elderly woman named Tamar, whose husband had died years before, leaving her to raise their grandchildren alone. She had watched with growing horror as her beloved city transformed into something she no longer recognized. The Sodom of her youth, while never perfect, had at least maintained some semblance of order, some respect for the basic bonds of hospitality and human decency. Now, as she held her trembling grandchildren close, she whispered prayers to the God of Abraham, pleading for deliverance she feared would never come. In another part of the city, A young man named Caleb sat in his workshop, his hands idle upon his potter's wheel. He had been one of the few to speak out against the growing violence, to argue for the ancient laws of hospitality when the mob had formed outside Lot's door. His words had fallen upon deaf ears, and now he wondered if he had sealed his own fate by standing against the tide. Yet he could not bring himself to regret his actions. Some things, he believed, were worth dying for, and the preservation of basic human dignity was surely among them. The morning sun continued its relentless climb, and with each passing hour, the heat grew more oppressive. It was not the clean heat of a desert day, but something heavier, more suffocating, as if the very air had become thick with judgment. Animals grew restless in their pens, sensing something their human masters could not yet perceive. Birds that normally filled the air with song fell silent, and even the insects seemed to withdraw into whatever shelter they could find. In the palace of Sodom's king, an emergency council convened as reports poured in from throughout the city. The events of the previous night had not been contained to a single district. They had spread like wildfire, igniting long smouldering resentments and tribal animosities that now threatened to tear the city apart from within. The king, a man who had built his power upon the very corruption that now consumed his realm, found himself facing a crisis he could not simply buy or intimidate his way out of. His advisors, men who had grown wealthy by enabling and profiting from the city's moral decay, now scrambled to find scapegoats and solutions. Some suggested rounding up the foreign residents, blaming them for the unrest. Others proposed new laws, harsher punishments, more guards in the streets. None seemed to grasp that the disease eating away at their society could not be cured by such superficial remedies. The rot had gone too deep, had infected too many hearts, had become too integral to the very fabric of their civilization. Meanwhile, in the neighboring city of Gomorrah, word of Sodom's troubles had arrived with the dawn caravans. Rather than serving as a warning, however, the news seemed to energize those who had long harbored their own grievances and desires for chaos. If Sodom could explode into violence, why not Gomorrah as well? If the old order was crumbling, why not hasten its collapse and see what could be built from the ruins? The parallels between the two cities had always been striking, but now they seemed locked in a deadly spiral, each feeding off the other's descent into madness. What one city began, the other eagerly amplified. What restraints remained in one place were quickly abandoned in the other. It was as if they were racing towards some terrible finish line, competing to see which could more thoroughly abandon every principle that had once made civilization possible. Yet even as the human drama unfolded in all its tragic complexity, there were signs that something far greater was stirring. The very elements seemed to be gathering for some cosmic reckoning. The wind, which had blown steadily from the west for weeks, began to shift and swirl unpredictably. The birds and beasts that had fled the cities were not merely seeking quieter places. They were fleeing eastward, as if guided by some instinct older than memory. Abraham, still maintaining his vigil upon the hilltop, noticed these signs with the keen eye of one who had walked with God for many years. The Lord had taught him to read the language of creation, to see in the movement of clouds and the behavior of animals the unfolding of divine purpose. What he saw now filled him with a dread deeper than any he had known since the day he had been called to leave his father's house and journey into the unknown. The sun reached its zenith, and the heat became truly unbearable. In the cities below, people began to seek whatever shade they could find, but there seemed to be no escape from the oppressive temperature. Wells that had never failed began to run low, and the very ground seemed to radiate heat like the stones around a forge. Some of the more observant residents began to wonder if this was some new kind of plague, some divine punishment for their city's sins. In Lot's house, the family huddled together in fearful silence. The The strangers who had brought such trouble upon them had departed before dawn, but not before issuing a warning that had shaken Lot to his very core. "Get out of this place," they had said, their voices carrying an authority that brooked no argument, "for the Lord will destroy this city." The words echoed in Lot's mind like the tolling of a funeral bell, and he found himself torn between disbelief and a growing certainty that judgment was indeed at hand. His wife and daughters had heard the warning too, but their reactions varied wildly. His wife, who had come to love their comfortable life in Sodom despite its moral compromises, refused to believe that destruction was truly imminent. Surely the strangers had been speaking metaphorically, she reasoned. Surely this was just another of the political upheavals that periodically swept through the region. Cities didn't simply disappear, especially not prosperous cities like Sodom and Gomorrah. His daughters, younger and perhaps more attuned to the spiritual dimensions of what was unfolding, felt the weight of impending doom more acutely. They had grown up in Sodom, but they had also been raised in Lot's household, where some memory of Abraham's God still lingered. They could sense that this was different from anything they had experienced before, that the very air around them was charged with divine purpose. As the afternoon wore on, the heat continued to intensify beyond anything the region had ever experienced. The Great Dead Sea, that inland ocean that bordered the cities, began to steam and bubble as if it were a massive cauldron set over an invisible fire. Fish that had survived in its salty waters for countless generations floated lifeless to the surface, while the shoreline itself seemed to shimmer and dance in the superheated air. The few righteous souls scattered throughout the cities found themselves drawn together by some invisible force, seeking comfort in shared prayer and mutual encouragement. They had no way of knowing that their very presence was what had held back the tide of judgment for so long, that their prayers and tears had been the thin thread keeping their communities from immediate destruction. Now, as even they began to sense that the end was near, their prayers took on a different character, shifting from pleas for mercy to cries for deliverance. In the heavenly realms, the angels who had been appointed as instruments of divine justice made their final preparations. These were not the cherubim and seraphim who surrounded the throne of God in eternal worship, but the mighty ones who served as executors of divine will when mercy could no longer hold back the demands of righteousness. They had witnessed the patient love with which the Lord had waited for these cities to repent, the countless opportunities that had been offered and spurned, the gradual hardening of hearts that had finally made judgment inevitable. The leader among them, whose name was known only in the courts of heaven, looked one final time upon the cities spread out below. Even now, even at this last moment, if genuine repentance had broken forth, if the people had fallen on their faces and cried out for forgiveness, mercy might yet have triumphed over judgment. But the cities remained defiant, their inhabitants too proud to acknowledge their need for divine grace, too hardened in their sin to recognize the precipice upon which they stood. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that seemed prophetic of the fire to come, the final countdown began. The earth itself seemed to sense what was approaching, trembling slightly, as if in anticipation. In distant places, sensitive souls found themselves overcome with inexplicable sadness, weeping for reasons they could not name, mourning for losses they had not yet experienced. Abraham, still maintaining his lonely vigil, fell to his knees as the weight of divine sorrow pressed down upon him like a physical force. He had interceded for these cities with all the passion of his heart, had argued with God himself for their preservation, had pleaded for mercy until his voice was hoarse and his strength was spent. Now, as he sensed the approach of judgment, he could only bow his head and trust that the judge of all the earth would indeed do right. even when that rightness demanded a terrible price. The shadows lengthened, and still the heat continued to build. Those few residents of the cities who retained any spiritual sensitivity found themselves overwhelmed with a sense of impending catastrophe. Some fled eastward, following the example of the animals, though they could not have said why. Others barricaded themselves in their homes, as if stone and timber could protect them from the wrath of the Almighty. Most simply continued in their willful blindness, refusing to acknowledge the signs that blazed all around them like beacons in the night. And in the silence between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, heaven held its breath and prepared to unleash upon the earth a demonstration of divine justice that would echo through the corridors of time, serving as both warning and promise, both judgment and mercy, reminding all who came after that the God of love is also the God of righteousness, and that his patience, though vast as the ocean, is not infinite. The day was drawing to its close, but for Sodom and Gomorrah, the night that was coming would be their last. As we reach the final chapter of this ancient tale, the morning sun rises over a landscape forever changed. Where once stood cities of abundance and corruption, now only silence remains, a silence that speaks louder than any proclamation of divine justice. The smoke that ascended like incense from a great furnace has dissipated, but the memory of that terrible night lingers in the collective consciousness of humanity. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as more than just a historical account of divine judgment. It stands as an eternal reminder that even in a world where darkness seems to prevail, where the innocent suffer alongside the guilty, and where righteousness appears to be a forgotten virtue, there remains an unwavering standard of moral truth. The cities that once thrived in their defiance of divine law now exist only in memory and in the salt-encrusted shores of the Dead Sea. Yet perhaps the most profound lesson lies not in the destruction itself, but in the moments that preceded it. Abraham's intercession reveals a God who is willing to spare entire cities for the sake of even a handful of righteous souls. The angel's patient warnings to Lot's family demonstrate divine mercy, extended even to those whose faith wavers. And Lot's wife, turned to a pillar of salt for her backward glance, reminds us that our hearts can remain tethered to corruption, even as our feet carry us towards salvation. In the gentle quiet of this evening, as you prepare for rest, consider how this ancient story continues to resonate through the ages. It speaks to the tension between justice and mercy that exists not only in the divine realm, but within our own hearts. It reminds us that hospitality to strangers might entertain angels unaware, and that our treatment of the vulnerable and marginalized reflects the true condition of our souls. The angels who walked among men in those final days of Sodom and Gomorrah serve as a bridge between the eternal and temporal, showing us that divine presence often comes disguised in ordinary human form. Their mission of investigation and rescue reveals a God who does not act hastily in judgment, but who observes carefully and intervenes mercifully whenever possible. As you drift toward sleep, let the silence that followed that ancient destruction become a peaceful quiet that settles over your own heart. May you find rest in knowing that the same divine justice that could not tolerate the persistent evil of those cities is balanced by a mercy that seeks always to preserve, protect, and redeem. The God who grieved over the necessity of judgment is the same God who rejoices over every soul that turns from darkness to light. Sleep well, knowing that morning always follows the darkest night, and that the God who watched over righteous Lot still watches over those who seek to live with integrity and compassion. In your dreams, may you find the peace that comes from walking uprightly, and may you wake refreshed and renewed, ready to be salt and light in your own corner of the world. The air was thick with the scent of dust and olive wood smoke, clinging to my robe as I sat beneath the ancient oaks of Mamre, the sun descending slow and deliberate over the hills to the west. I could feel the dry earth radiating the heat it had stored through the day, the kind of heat that seeps into your bones and lingers there long after the light has faded. It was in that stillness, where the bleating of sheep was replaced by the low hum of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves, that I found myself alone with the God who had called me out of Ur, away from all that was familiar, into a covenant that promised both blessing and testing in equal measure. I thought of the journeys that had brought me here, of the altars I had built on windswept hillsides, of the promises whispered under starlit skies so vast and unending they seemed to swallow my doubts whole. Yet on this evening, with twilight deepening and shadows stretching long across the valley floor, I sensed a heaviness in the air. Not the gentle weight of coming night, but something more profound, more ominous, as though the very earth itself trembled beneath the burden of unspoken sorrow. It was then that I heard them, footsteps carried softly on the cooling breeze, deliberate and unhurried. 3 figures approached, their outlines blurred by the wavering heat rising from the plains below, yet their presence undeniable. There was a quiet authority in their stride, a gravity that made even the birds fall silent in the branches overhead. Though my eyes were aged and my body worn by years of wandering, my spirit recognized them at once. These were no ordinary travelers seeking food and shelter for the night. This was a visitation. I rose quickly, as one should in the face of the sacred, my heart pounding with the duality of fear and reverence. In the ancient ways of our people, hospitality was not a mere courtesy, but a commandment as binding as any written law, and I would not be found wanting. I bowed low to the ground, dust rising around me like incense, and hastened to prepare bread from the finest flour, a calf tender, and good, curds and milk. All that I had, which could honour such guests. But even as Sarah worked behind the tent's veil, and I offered water for their feet, a whisper stirred in my chest, a knowing that these acts of service were but preludes to a far weightier exchange. For there was a grief in their eyes, though their faces bore no lines of mortal worry, and their voices, when they spoke, carried the cadence of eternity. I sensed in them the stillness of mountains and the fire of stars, the quiet patience of oceans waiting on the moon's pull. When at last they spoke of my wife, of the impossible life yet to grow within her barren womb, my laughter came unbidden, not for lack of faith, but from the tremor of standing too close to glory, the way a man laughs when confronted with the terrifying beauty of thunder rolling across the hills. But the laughter faded quickly as I perceived their true purpose. For as the meal concluded and they rose to leave, the air seemed to tighten, the breeze stilled, and the shadows deepened unnaturally fast, as though creation itself strained to listen. One of them, no, not one, but the Lord himself, turned to the others and spoke words not meant for mortal ears, yet carried to me all the same. Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? My breath caught in my chest as the fullness of his intent settled over me like a mantle too heavy to bear. He spoke of Sodom and Gomorrah, of a cry rising up from the cities of the plain, an outcry of injustice, of cruelty, of sins so grievous they had pierced the heavens. It was not the cry of a single victim, but the collective wail of the oppressed, echoing through the cosmos until it reached the throne of the Almighty. And in that moment, I understood the sorrow etched into the lines of his voice. This was not the wrath of a capricious God, quick to anger and eager to destroy. No, this was the ache of a creator watching his creation unravel, of a father seeing his children turn from light to darkness. the Lord of all the earth, whose word had brought forth galaxies, and whose breath had stirred dust into life, now spoke of descending to see for himself the depth of human depravity, not because he lacked knowledge, but because his justice demanded presence, demanded witness, demanded a thoroughness no angelic report could satisfy. I stood there, the ground beneath my feet suddenly seeming fragile, as though the weight of divine judgment might shatter it. The breeze carried with it the faintest scent of sulphur, or perhaps it was only my imagination, stirred by the gravity of the moment. I thought of Lot, my nephew, and his family dwelling within those cursed gates. I thought of the children laughing in the streets of Sodom, their innocence snared in a web of corruption they could not name. And I thought of the nature of justice, of whether it could be pure if the righteous perished alongside the wicked. As the two angels turned toward the cities and began their descent into the valley, I felt the courage of desperation rise within me. I stepped forward into the fading light, my voice catching as I called out, not to a distant deity, but to a friend, to the judge of all the earth who yet invited me into dialogue. The weight of the outcry pressed down on us both, heaven and earth trembling in the tension between mercy and justice, between judgment deferred and judgment unleashed. And there, in the hush of the encroaching night, I prepared to speak, not as one pleading for strangers, but as one standing in the gap for a world on the brink of consuming itself. The silence between us was thick, almost tangible, as though the air itself had been pressed into stillness by the weight of what was about to unfold. I could feel the dust clinging to my feet, warm from the day's heat, yet a chill had settled deep into my chest. The two figures, those angels whose very presence seemed to hum with restrained power, were already descending the slope towards Sodom, their silhouettes shrinking against the vastness of the valley. But the third figure remained, standing near me under the oaks of Mamre. There was no mistaking him now. This was no mere emissary or apparition. This was the Lord himself, cloaked not in fire or storm, but in the quiet dignity of a traveller. Yet I sensed in him the same force that had once called the universe into being, the same voice that had whispered into nothingness and birthed stars. To stand so near was to feel the infinite compressed into a form my frail senses could almost comprehend. And I could not stay silent. The words rose in me unbidden, drawn not from courage but from desperation. My mind flashed to Lot, my nephew who had chosen the fertile plains for his flocks, unaware then of the moral quicksand waiting beneath Sodom's fertile soil. I saw his wife, his daughters, their faces blurred by memory, yet heavy with the weight of family. Were they too to be consumed in the coming fire? Could the righteous perish simply because they had made their dwelling among the wicked? Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? The question slipped from my lips like a tremor, yet once spoken, it rang loud in my ears, an audacity I could scarcely believe was my own. My heart hammered as I pressed on, clinging to the hope that mercy might yet outweigh judgment. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city, I said, each word deliberate, trembling. Will you then sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? The words hung there between us, fragile as spider's silk, yet somehow unbroken. The silence that followed was not cold or dismissive, but heavy with consideration, as though the Eternal himself weighed the scales of justice anew in that moment. And then came the reply, calm and certain. If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Relief surged through me, hot and dizzying, but it was fleeting. For even as I heard the words, I saw in my mind's eye the crowded streets, the markets thick with people, and I wondered, were there even 50 who had not been swept away by the tide of corruption? Had the rot gone so deep that no such remnant remained? My voice came again, softer now, tinged with both humility and urgency. Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And again, the voice of the Almighty, steady as the foundation of the world. I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. The negotiation had begun, not as between equals, but between a desperate man and the source of all life, between frailty and omnipotence. Yet with each exchange, I sensed no anger, no impatience, only a strange tenderness, as though God himself took no pleasure in the words of judgment he was bound to pronounce. I pressed on, emboldened by grace that should have been too vast to approach. Suppose 40 are found there. I will not do it for the sake of 40. Let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. I will not do it if I find 30 there. Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Each response was a lifeline, each concession a glimpse into the heart of a God whose justice burned like a consuming fire, yet was tempered by a mercy deeper than oceans. But still, I could not stop. The image of Lot's daughters haunted me, their laughter in safer days, their innocence now threatened by a city that had forgotten what it meant to honor life. Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. The pause that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, as though all of heaven held its breath. The oaks overhead creaked gently in the evening breeze, the world itself tilting between ruin and reprieve. For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. The words fell like rain upon parched ground, a promise of mercy so great it might have seemed impossible were it not spoken by the one whose word had fashioned galaxies. Yet beneath the relief, a cold thread of dread wound its way through my heart. For I knew Sodom, knew its people, knew the depths to which they had fallen. Were there even 10 left uncorrupted? 10 hearts still beating in rhythm with righteousness? 10 voices lifted in prayer amidst the cacophony of violence and vice? The Lord turned then, his form already receding as the shadows deepened, and I was left alone beneath the oaks, my knees weak, my lips dry from the desert air. I had dared to wrestle with the Almighty and lived, but the outcome of that divine conversation was still uncertain. The weight of intercession settled heavy upon my shoulders. Behind me, Sarah moved quietly within the tent, unaware of the cosmic negotiations that had just unfolded. Before me lay the plains of the Jordan, shimmering in the fading light, and beyond them, the cities whose fate now hung by the slenderest of threads. The sun's final rays painted the sky in blood and gold, and as darkness rose from the valley floor like a living thing, I whispered a prayer, not for vindication, not for understanding, but for mercy. Mercy for a people who had squandered every chance. Mercy for a world teetering on the brink of destruction. Mercy from the God whose justice was perfect and whose patience was nearly spent. And as I stood there in the gathering night, the first faint scent of sulphur on the wind, I could not help but wonder whether even my boldest prayers would be enough to stay the hand of judgment that now hovered over Sodom and Gomorrah. The valley stretched out before them like a vast, sunken cauldron, its edges hazy in the dying light, the air heavy with a suffocating stillness that seemed to deepen with every step they took. The two figures, radiant though cloaked in the semblance of mortal travellers, moved steadily down the dusty path, their sandaled feet stirring little more than whispers from the parched earth. From afar they might have seemed like any other men journeying at dusk, their garments brushed by the dry wind that carried with it the faint stench of stagnant water and something acrid, something faintly metallic that clung stubbornly to the nostrils. But heaven knew, and the earth felt it too, these were no ordinary men. These were envoys of judgment, carrying within their silent forms the weight of divine justice soon to be poured out upon a city that had long ceased to remember its creator. The path into Sodom wound through olive groves long untended, their branches twisted and heavy with dust, their fruit shriveled and rotting where it hung. The land, once lush and envied for its fertility, now bore a subtle corruption, as though creation itself recoiled from the sins that had seeped into the soil. Small creatures, lizards, hares, nightbirds, fled into the underbrush at the sound of approaching steps, guided by an instinct older than memory that whispered of danger, of the unraveling of all things. Ahead, Sodom's gates loomed, their wooden beams darkened with age and stained with the grime of countless hands. The city walls, though still standing, bore scars, cracks running like veins across sun-baked clay, sections sagging where the stones no longer fit snugly together. Torches flickered in iron brackets, their flames dancing wildly in the growing breeze, casting distorted shadows upon the ground. And from beyond the gates rose a low murmur, a restless hum of voices carried on the evening air, laughter too sharp, arguments pitched high, cries muffled quickly in alleyways. As the two drew closer, the guards lounging at the entrance barely glanced up, their eyes glassy with drink, their mouths curled in sneers born of long familiarity with power unchecked. Strangers were not unusual in Sodom. Merchants, wanderers, and fugitives alike often passed through its gates. But these travellers bore no wares, no pack animals laden with goods, no visible marks of servitude or fear. There was something in their gait, unhurried, unflinching, that pricked at the edges of even dulled instincts. Inside, the streets of Sodom twisted like snakes, narrow and crowded, their stones slick with refuse and filth. Stalls lined the thoroughfares, though most vendors had shuttered for the night, their goods hidden behind rough-hewn planks and makeshift locks. The few who remained hawked their wares with voices like cracked whips, jewelry of tarnished gold, wine sour enough to curdle the stomach, fruits bruised and crawling with flies. Beggars clung to the walls, their eyes hollow, hands outstretched to passers-by who brushed them aside with practiced indifference. Here and there, the smell of roasted meat wafted from open doorways, mingling with the acrid tang of smoke and human sweat. But beneath it all was another scent, subtle, yet pervasive, decay, both physical and moral, the rot of a city that had traded the sacred for the profane and no longer knew the difference. It was in this place that Lot saw them. From his vantage point near the city gate, a position of some influence, though one earned through compromises that still gnawed at his conscience, he noticed the two travellers immediately. Not for their beauty, though there was a quiet grace in their bearing. Not for their garments, though they were clean, where others were soiled, but for the aura that seemed to ripple around them, unseen yet undeniable, as though the air itself bent slightly to accommodate their passing. Something in Lot's heart clenched. He rose quickly, his hands brushing dust from his robe, and approached them with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief, for their presence stirred memories of righteousness, of his uncle's God, whom he had tried, feebly, imperfectly, to honour even in this place. Dread, for he sensed, without knowing how, that their arrival heralded more than mere chance. "My lords," he said, bowing low in the traditional manner, though his voice trembled slightly, betraying a nervousness born not of fear for himself, but for them. "Please turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night there. Wash your feet, and in the morning you may rise early and go on your way." It was not a mere invitation, but a plea. Lot knew too well the nature of his city, the depravity that simmered just beneath the surface, waiting only for nightfall to erupt into full expression. To leave these strangers in the open square would be to abandon them to a fate too vile to name. At first, they answered with a calm assurance that they would spend the night in the square. But Lot, his urgency mounting, pressed them with a fervour that bordered on desperation. He could not explain his insistence without speaking aloud the unspeakable, but his eyes conveyed what his tongue could not. After a moment's pause, they acquiesced, and he led them quickly through the winding streets toward his home. The house of Lot stood modest among others, its walls plain and unadorned, its doors reinforced not for beauty, but for necessity. Inside, his wife busied herself with preparations, her movements brisk yet distracted, while his daughters glanced nervously at their guests. The lamps were lit, casting pools of amber light upon the earthen floor, and a meal was set before them, unleavened bread hastily prepared, lentils simmered in a pot over the hearth. Yet even as they ate, a growing unease settled over the household. It was not the simple nervousness of entertaining guests, but something heavier, a foreboding that seemed to seep through the very walls. Outside, the streets had grown louder. Voices rose and fell in drunken revelry, punctuated by sharp cries and laughter that was too harsh, too eager. Footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, pairs and groups converging, their pace unhurried yet purposeful. Lot's eyes flicked repeatedly to the door, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. He knew the habits of his neighbours, their hunger for novelty, their disdain for restraint. Strangers, especially those with an air of difference about them, never passed unnoticed for long in Sodom. And as the night deepened, the first fists began to pound against the door. The night had deepened into that heavy, oppressive darkness which seems to carry a life of its own, a darkness that does not merely obscure, but suffocates, pressing down like a wet cloth over the mouth of the city. The narrow streets of Sodom lay cloaked in it, though here and there the flicker of torches revealed glimpses of broken cobblestones slick with spilled wine and filth, of alleyways where shadows slithered and whispered. Above, the sky was starless, as though even the heavens had turned their gaze away from the depravity festering below. Inside Lot's modest dwelling, the air was thick with unease. The two strangers sat calmly at the low table, their expressions unreadable. Yet their very stillness seemed charged with an invisible power, as though the walls themselves trembled in quiet anticipation of what they already knew must come. Lot paced near the doorway, his robe clutched tightly about him, eyes darting toward the shuttered windows, as if he could somehow hold back the rising tide of menace with sheer vigilance. His wife and daughters sat pressed together in the corner, their faces pale in the lamplight, their fingers twisting nervously at the edges of their garments. At first, it began with whispers, harsh, guttural voices just beyond the threshold, punctuated by low, mocking laughter. Then came the sound of boots scuffing against the stones, of many feet converging from different streets, the cadence quickening as though a predator had caught the scent of prey. The first fist struck the door with a dull thud, tentative yet heavy enough to send a shiver through the wooden frame. A moment later, another joined it. Then another. The blows grew in force and rhythm, soon accompanied by the guttural chant of voices rising in a discordant chorus. "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" they cried, their words thick with mockery and hunger. "Bring them out to us, that we may know them." The demand was not merely carnal. It was a proclamation of dominance, a ritualized display of power by a society that had long since ceased to honor even the most basic principles of decency. This was Sodom's true face, bared in the cover of night. A city so steeped in corruption that the arrival of strangers was not an opportunity for hospitality, but an invitation to violence. Lot's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed his back to the door, feeling the wood shudder with each renewed assault. His voice, trembling yet resolute, rose above the din. "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." But the words, though spoken with all the urgency of a man pleading for life, were swallowed by the roar of the gathering mob. They came in waves now, young and old alike, their faces twisted in drunken glee, in lust, in the cruel delight of those emboldened by the anonymity of the crowd. Torches flared in the darkness, their flames throwing jagged shadows across the courtyard as more feet pounded the stones, more hands slammed against the door. Lot's daughters clung to each other, their knuckles white, their breaths shallow and rapid. His wife turned her face toward the wall, her shoulders shaking, though no sound escaped her lips. The two visitors, however, remained seated, their calm utterly unshaken, even as the house itself seemed to rattle with the force of the onslaught outside. The mob's cries grew louder, more insistent, devolving into a cacophony of threats and jeers. Stones began to strike the walls, sending small clouds of dust drifting down from the rafters. "Bring them out!" they howled, their voices cracking with desire and rage. "Do you think to keep them from us? Are you their judge now? You dare to deny Sodom its pleasure?" Lot's mind raced. He had been taught the sacred duty of hospitality since childhood, a law more ancient than kings, more binding than blood. To betray these men, guests under his roof, would be to violate not only custom, but the very covenant of human dignity. And yet, how could he hold back such a tide? In desperation, he flung the door open just wide enough to step outside, his body trembling as the heat and stench of the crowd washed over him. He raised his hands, palms outward, as if to hold back the sea with mere flesh. "I beg you, do not do this evil," he cried, his voice cracking with the weight of futility. "See now, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." A gasp escaped his wife within the house, a sound of anguish so sharp it seemed to pierce even the din of the mob. His daughters recoiled, their eyes wide with shock and betrayal, yet they made no sound. In Sodom, silence had long been the armor of the powerless. But the offer, desperate as it was, only stoked the crowd's fury. Their laughter turned cruel, edged with venom. "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." The first hand reached for Lot's robe, fingers like claws closing around the fabric. Others surged forward, their bodies pressing close, the smell of sweat and wine choking in its intensity. Lot struggled, his feet slipping against the stones, his cries lost in the roaring chaos. And then a hand reached out from within the house, a hand that seemed unremarkable in form, yet radiated an authority that stilled even the seething madness outside. It grasped Lot's shoulder and pulled him back through the threshold as easily as a man plucks a reed from water. The door slammed shut with a sound like a thunderclap. Outside, the mob howled and clawed at the wood, their fists pounding in a frenzied rhythm. But then the visitors moved, their calm broken at last, not with panic or fear, but with the decisive precision of those who wield a power beyond mortal reckoning. A sudden flash of light seared through the cracks in the door, brighter than any torch, purer than any flame. A sound like rushing wind filled the house as the strangers spoke words in a language that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of the bones, words that struck not the ears, but the soul. And outside, the mob faltered, Hands flew to faces, cries of pain and confusion rising as men stumbled and fell, groping blindly at the air. Their eyes, once filled with ravenous hunger, now stared sightless, their sockets scalded by an unseen fire. The pounding ceased. The courtyard fell silent, save for the groans of the blind, their bodies writhing on the stones as they clawed helplessly at the ground, unable to find even the door they had sought to break. Inside, the lamps flickered, their flames bowing as if in deference to the power that had just been unleashed. Lot and his family huddled together, trembling not with fear of the mob, but with awe at the revelation of their guest's true nature. The two strangers stood, their forms somehow larger now, their eyes aglow with a light not of this world. "The time of warning is past," one said, his voice calm yet edged with urgency. "Gather your household, take those you love and flee from this place. For the outcry against this city has reached the Lord, and he will not delay his judgment." The night dragged on, each moment stretching thin, as if time itself resisted moving forward toward the inevitable. Outside, the air hung heavy with the lingering cries of the blinded mob, their voices now subdued into groans of confusion and fear. The streets, once alive with revelry and violence, had fallen into an eerie silence, a silence so profound it seemed unnatural, as though even the insects and night birds dared not disturb the stillness. Within the dimly lit house, Lot and his family sat huddled, their bodies pressed tightly together on the earthen floor. The two visitors, no longer merely travelers in his eyes, but beings of incomprehensible authority, stood watchful near the door, their faces serene yet taut with a quiet urgency. The air seemed charged around them, alive with a subtle hum, like the low rumble of thunder felt in the chest before a storm breaks overhead. "Gather all who belong to you," one of them said, his voice soft, yet carrying a weight that made Lot's bones vibrate with its resonance. "Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, and any you have in the city. Bring them out of this place, for the Lord will destroy it." The words struck like a hammer blow. Destroy it. The phrase echoed again and again in Lot's mind, colliding with the memory of Abraham's intercession, of pleas rising into the night for mercy to shield this place. But now the time for pleading had ended. Judgment no longer hovered as a possibility. It had become certainty. Lot staggered to his feet, his limbs stiff from fear and exhaustion, and stumbled to the small inner rooms where his sons-in-law lay sleeping. He shook them awake with trembling hands, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "Get up! Get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But they laughed. Bleary-eyed and unsteady with wine, they smirked at him as though he were telling some macabre jest. "Destroy the city?" they scoffed. "You've been listening to those desert preachers again, haven't you? Go back to bed, old man." Their laughter burned in Lot's ears as he turned away, his chest constricting with a mixture of shame and grief. Even now, with the weight of heaven pressing down upon Sodom, they could not see. The years spent among these people, breathing the poisoned air of their complacency, had dulled even his own sense of urgency. When he returned to the main room, the two angels fixed him with eyes that seemed to pierce to the marrow. "Up," they said firmly, their voices now edged with command. "Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But Lot hesitated. His gaze drifted toward the city beyond the door, toward the familiar streets and houses, the market stalls and fountains, the life he had built piece by piece in this place of compromise. Was it all to be abandoned so suddenly, so completely? Could he not have one more hour, one more chance to reason with his family, to salvage something from the ruin that loomed? The angels exchanged a glance, and in that silent communication, a decision was made. No longer would they wait for Lot's resolve to catch up with divine urgency. With hands that felt both gentle and unyielding, they seized his arm and the arms of his wife and daughters, their grip strong enough to leave a faint heat upon the skin. And they pulled. Lot stumbled forward, his family clinging to one another as they were guided swiftly, almost effortlessly, through the narrow streets. The houses of Sodom, dark and silent, seemed to lean inward like sinister witnesses to their flight. From distant alleys came the occasional sound of movement, of shuffling feet and muffled weeping. The blinded men still groping in confusion, unaware that their time to repent had long since passed. As they reached the edge of the city, the angels paused, their faces turned eastward toward the faint glimmer of dawn creeping over the horizon. The first rays of light broke across the sky, painting it in hues of pale gold and crimson that seemed almost too vivid, too intense, as though creation itself strained under the tension of what was to come. "Escape for your life," one of them said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." Lot's heart lurched. To the hills. How could they survive there, with no supplies, no shelter? The thought of the barren heights, so far removed from the fertile plain he had once chosen with such eagerness, filled him with dread. "Oh no, my lords," he whispered hoarsely. "Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." The angel regarded him for a long moment, and then nodded. "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until you arrive." Thus Zoar, the small and insignificant town that had seemed a mere footnote in the geography of the plain, became the lone refuge from the fire poised to fall. And as Lot and his family fled, driven by a terror too deep for words, the first faint rumble shook the earth beneath their feet. It was subtle at first, a tremor like the shifting of great stones deep below the surface. But it grew rapidly, a low roar that seemed to rise from the bowels of the earth itself. Behind them, the sky blackened as clouds boiled upward with unnatural speed, churning with flashes of red and orange like embers caught in a whirlwind. The smell of sulfur thickened in the air, acrid and choking, burning the throat and stinging the eyes. Animals fled in every direction, goats bleating in panic, birds screaming as they took to the air, sensing the oncoming cataclysm long before human minds could grasp its magnitude. But Lot's wife faltered. She slowed, her steps growing uncertain, her head turning ever so slightly as though drawn by an invisible cord back toward the city. Behind her, the ground shook more violently, and a sound like 1,000 thunderclaps rolled across the valley. "Do not look back." The angel's warning echoed in Lot's memory, sharp and urgent. But it was too late. She turned, and in that instant, her form stiffened, her body arrested in motion as though the very air had solidified around her. Crystals of salt bloomed across her skin, creeping with unnatural speed until she stood encased, a motionless pillar glinting faintly in the eerie light. Her face, still turned towards Sodom, bore no expression save for one of longing, longing for the life she could not release, even as it was consumed in divine fire. Lot's daughters cried out in horror, but their father, struck mute by grief and terror, pulled them onward. Behind them, the heavens opened. Fire and sulfur rained down from above, torrents of destruction so fierce they seemed to tear the sky itself asunder. The cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, vanished beneath the assault, their proud towers crumbling like clay pots dashed against rock, their streets swallowed by the fury of divine judgment. The roar of it was deafening, a sound that seemed to shake the foundations of the world, a sound that would echo through the corridors of history as a warning to every generation that followed. From his vantage point far away, Abraham saw the smoke rise like the smoke of a great furnace, dark and towering against the pale dawn. His heart ached with a sorrow too deep for tears, and he whispered a prayer, not of protest, but of surrender. The judge of all the earth had done what was right. The hills rose before them like the ribs of some ancient, slumbering beast, their jagged silhouettes etched in stark relief against a sky still smudged with the ash and smoke of destruction. Lot stumbled forward, his legs burning with each step, his lungs raw from the acrid air that clung to the valley like a curse. Behind him, his daughters clung to his robes, their faces streaked with sweat and soot, their breaths shallow and uneven. No words passed between them now. What words could suffice in the aftermath of such devastation? The world they had known lay obliterated behind them, and in its place stretched only silence, vast and unbroken, save for the faint hiss of cooling embers carried on the wind. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself sought to pull them back, to tether them to the ruins of Sodom where fire still raged, unseen yet felt in the searing heat that radiated across the plain. Lot's mind, though dulled by exhaustion, replayed the events of that night in jagged fragments, the pounding of fists on his door, the blinding flash that had stilled the mob, the firm hands of the angels gripping his arms and dragging him into motion when his will had faltered. And then her. The image of his wife stood fixed in his memory, as immovable as the pillar of salt she had become. One moment she was beside him, her hand clutched tightly in his. The next she had turned. Just a glance, a backward flicker of longing toward the life she had built, the home she had left behind, the city that even in its corruption had offered familiarity and comfort. And in that instant, the breath seemed to leave her body, her skin paling to a crystalline sheen, her form hardening until she stood motionless, a monument to hesitation, to divided loyalties, to the danger of hearts tethered to dying things. Lot had not looked back. He could not. The angel's warning still rang in his ears. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. And yet, in the hollow of his chest, he felt as though something essential had been torn from him, leaving a cavity where his hope had once lived. The climb to Zoar was torturous. The path wound through dry ravines and over rocky outcrops, each turn revealing only more barren land stretching endlessly ahead. The hills offered no shelter from the rising sun, whose rays now fell harsh and unrelenting upon the scorched earth. The heat pressed down like a hand intent on crushing them, the air shimmering with waves of distortion, as though the very fabric of creation buckled under the weight of divine judgment. Lot's daughters walked in silence, their steps faltering yet steady. Their eyes, wide with fear and shock, held a blankness that chilled him more than tears would have. They had seen too much, their innocence scorched away in a single night. Once, they had laughed in the streets of Sodom, their voices mingling with the marketplace clamour. Now their lips were cracked and dry, their laughter buried beneath layers of ash and grief. When at last Zoar came into view, a small cluster of stone dwellings huddled against the base of a hill, it seemed less a refuge than a shadow of what safety might have meant. The gates, if they could be called such, hung crooked on their hinges, and the few figures who moved within the walls glanced up briefly at the newcomers before turning away with the practiced indifference of those accustomed to loss. Here they found no welcome, no words of comfort, only the strained silence of a people who knew too well the price of proximity to power and judgment. But Lot could not stay. though spared from the initial onslaught, Zor bore the same uneasy stillness that had settled over the entire valley. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as though the soil itself grieved, and each night the scent of sulphur crept into his nostrils, making sleep fitful and haunted. His daughters, too, seemed restless, their eyes darting toward the hills as though some primal instinct urged them to flee still farther from the desolation that lingered unseen, yet palpable. So they left again, this time without angelic guidance, climbing into the highlands until they found a cave, a dark hollow in the rock where the air was cool and the silence absolute. Here, in this refuge carved by time and weather, Lot collapsed. His body, pushed beyond endurance, finally yielded to exhaustion, and he slept the heavy, dreamless sleep of one who has outrun not only danger but memory itself. But the cave's silence was deceptive. In its shadows, the daughters whispered, their voices low and urgent, their words carrying the weight of a terrible isolation. They believed themselves alone in the world, the last remnants of humanity, cut off from any future. Their thoughts turned dark, born of desperation and the raw instinct to preserve life at any cost. What they resolved in that cave would ripple outward through generations, birthing nations whose enmity with Israel would mirror the tragedy of their beginnings. Lot, for all his efforts to walk in righteousness, never knew. His days passed in a haze, his mind dulled by grief and age, his prayers a litany of regret whispered into the cold stone walls. He had sought to live among men, to preserve some semblance of prosperity and influence in Sodom, but in the end, he had been reduced to a hollowed man in a hollowed world, clinging to life while the past turned to salt behind him. And beyond the hills, the valley of the Jordan lay quiet. The cities of the plain, once bustling centers of trade and culture, were now little more than scorched earth and rising smoke, their memory preserved in the bitter waters of the Dead Sea, where nothing could live. Travelers would one day avoid the place, their footsteps quickening as they passed, their eyes averted from the horizon where pillars of salt glimmered faintly in the sun, silent sentinels to a warning written in ash and fire. Abraham stood far off, on the rise where he had watched the morning unfold. The wind carried to him the faint, acrid scent of sulphur, and his eyes, red and weary from a sleepless night, traced the columns of smoke rising like funeral pyres into the heavens. He thought of the cities, of the countless lives consumed in fire, and his heart ached with a sorrow too deep for words. He had interceded, pleaded with the Almighty for mercy, bargaining down to 10 righteous souls. Yet now he understood that even 10 could not be found. His thoughts turned to Lot. Had he escaped? Was he among the living, or had he perished in the flames with those who mocked divine justice? Abraham would not know for many days, yet even in his uncertainty, he whispered a prayer, not of protest, not of anger, but of surrender to the wisdom of the judge of all the earth. For in this judgment, he saw not the caprice of an angry deity, but the sorrow of a creator, grieved beyond measure by the corruption of his creation. In the hills, Lot and his daughters sat huddled in their cave, the world outside reduced to silence and dust. The weight of what they had fled was inescapable, pressing down on them like the heavy air before a storm. Though spared from the immediate destruction, Lot felt himself a man utterly undone. His wife was gone, her memory preserved only in the bitter image of her pillar of salt, a monument to hesitation and longing for a life that could never be reclaimed. He thought of the years spent in Sodom, of the compromises made, the warnings ignored, the slow erosion of faith as he sought to maintain peace with a people who had long since abandoned their covenant with decency. He had entered the city with wealth and ambition, believing he could live righteously among the unrighteous. Yet in the end, he had fled with nothing but the clothes on his back and the haunting knowledge that even those he loved most could not be persuaded to follow him. In the stillness of the cave, his daughters whispered among themselves, their voices hushed yet urgent. Believing they were the last survivors of humanity, they made choices born of desperation, choices that would echo through generations in ways they could not foresee. From their union would come the Moabites and the Ammonites, nations destined to stand in uneasy opposition to the descendants of Abraham. Thus, even in survival, the shadow of Sodom stretched long and unbroken. Beyond the hills, the plain of the Jordan grew desolate. The soil, once rich and inviting, hardened into a crust of salt and ash. The waters of the great inland sea grew heavier, more lifeless, so dense with minerals that no fish could swim, no plant could root. Travelers, in centuries to come, would speak in hushed tones of the Sea of Death, its shores littered with strange formations, twisted like the bodies of those who had perished in the fire. They would point to the faint glimmer of salt pillars in the distance, whispering tales of divine wrath and the woman who looked back. Yet the destruction was not without purpose. It stood as a monument, not merely to judgment, but to the relentless justice of God, intertwined with his mercy. The fire had fallen, yet warning had been given. Opportunity for repentance had been extended again and again, ignored until it was too late. The angels had come not first as agents of destruction, but as messengers of salvation. Even in wrath, there was grace for Lot, for his daughters, for those willing to turn their faces toward the hills and not back toward the city. As centuries unfolded, prophets would recall Sodom and Gomorrah, their names becoming synonymous with depravity and ruin. Ezekiel would write not only of sexual immorality, but of pride, excess, and neglect of the poor. Sins that had corrupted the very foundations of these cities. Isaiah would warn his generation, comparing their corruption to that of Sodom. And Christ himself would invoke the memory of these places as a warning of the coming judgment upon a world grown callous and self-assured. Yet in every telling, there lingered a whisper of hope. For though the cities fell, the God who judged them remained patient with his creation. Though the fire consumed, mercy still found its way to the few who would receive it. As night settled over the hills and stars pricked the dark sky, Lot lay awake in the cave, staring at the rough ceiling above. He no longer prayed for prosperity or comfort. He prayed only for understanding, for some sign that the God of his uncle had not abandoned him entirely. And in that stillness, a gentle truth took root in his weary heart, that survival itself was a mercy, that even in loss there remained the possibility of redemption. Though his future was uncertain, though the weight of his choices pressed heavy, he had been spared, and perhaps, in some distant tomorrow, his descendants might yet turn their hearts back to the God who judges justly and loves fiercely. The valley slept now, its fires spent, its cities reduced to memory, but their lesson endured, a lesson written not in ink but in ash and salt, a reminder that justice and mercy are never far apart in the heart of the Almighty. As you, dear listener, drift towards sleep, carry this story not as a tale of despair, but as a beacon, faint yet steady in the night. Remember that the same God who judged Sodom and Gomorrah is the God who heard Abraham's prayer, who sent angels to deliver Lot, who even now watches over a world in need of his mercy. Rest now, knowing that his justice is perfect, his mercy unending, and his love extends even into the wastelands. Sleep, and let the lessons of the plains settle deep in your soul like rain upon parched earth. For morning will come again, and with it the chance to walk in righteousness anew. The night in Zoar was not the refuge Lot had hoped it might be. Though spared from the rain of fire and sulphur, the small city bore its own oppressive weight. an unease that seemed to seep into the stones of its walls, into the very air his lungs struggled to draw. The people of Zor, silent and watchful, eyed the newcomers with a wary suspicion that bordered on fear. Whispers followed Lot and his daughters wherever they went, hushed words spoken behind cupped hands, eyes darting toward the horizon, where faint tendrils of smoke still rose like phantom fingers clawing at the heavens. The three of them lay in the corner of a low-ceilinged room, its walls of rough stone cool against their backs. The oil lamp flickered weakly, casting elongated shadows that danced across the cracked floor, shadows that seemed almost alive in their ceaseless twisting. Lot's daughters had drifted into a restless sleep, their bodies curled inward, their faces turned away as though trying to shut out the world beyond their eyelids. But sleep eluded Lot. He lay on his side, eyes fixed on the dim glow of the lamp, and felt the full weight of silence pressing in on him. It was not the peaceful silence of night in the countryside. It was a suffocating void, heavy with all that had been lost, all that had been destroyed, all that could never be reclaimed. He heard no voices from the streets, no laughter from neighbors, no sounds of children playing, only the occasional creak of wood, the muted scuff of feet in distant corridors, and the low moan of wind slipping through narrow alleys. But within his own mind, the silence was far from empty. Images rose unbidden, vivid and sharp, searing him with their clarity. He saw again the gates of Sodom on the day he first arrived. A younger man then, eyes bright with ambition, drawn to the wealth and opportunity that gleamed within those walls. He had told himself he could remain righteous, even in a city so steeped in sin, that he could shield his family, that he could live among them without becoming like them. But as years passed, he had learned to avert his gaze, to silence his conscience for the sake of peace. He remembered walking the streets and hearing the cries of a beggar being dragged into an alley by men who laughed as they stripped him of his few possessions. He had quickened his pace, head down, telling himself it was not his place to interfere, that he was only a sojourner, a guest. Another time, at the city gates, he had seen a widow turned away from the market, her wares scattered and trampled underfoot as guards jeered. He had clenched his fists, felt his blood rise, and then swallowed it down, turning instead to his own affairs, telling himself he could do nothing. Each memory now struck him like a blow, the sum of 1,000 small compromises that had led him, step by step, into a life of quiet complicity. He had thought himself different from the others, thought his faith unshaken. But had he not offered his own daughters to the mob? Had he not hesitated when the angels urged him to flee? Even now, safe in Zoar's walls, did not his heart still ache for the comfort of Sodom, for the life he had built among its people? Lot pressed a trembling hand to his face. The stench of sulfur still clung to his skin, inescapable, acrid, as though the city's ruin had marked him in body as well as soul. He felt the memory of his wife's hand slipping from his own, the crushing emptiness of her absence, and he wondered if her fate had not been his as well, if he too was little more than a pillar of salt in motion, hollowed out by longing for a place that no longer existed. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest echoes from the valley below. It might have been nothing more than the groaning of burned timbers collapsing in distant ruins. But to Lot's ears it sounded like voices, thin, distorted, wailing in the darkness. Were they the cries of the dying, still clinging to the charred bones of their homes? Or was it only his own guilt-given sound, a chorus of condemnation rising from the ashes? He closed his eyes, but behind them rose visions more terrible than the darkness before him. He saw faces, familiar and strange, contorted in fear as fire rained from the heavens. He saw children clutching their mothers, merchants shielding their eyes from the blinding light, leaders standing defiant on palace steps until the flames consumed even their arrogance. And all the while, a voice, low, unrelenting, whispered, "You lived among them. You dined at their tables. You called them neighbors." Lot's breath came in shallow gasps as he fought the urge to cry out. His daughters stirred in their sleep, one whimpering softly, and he forced himself into stillness, unwilling to wake them into the same torment that gripped him. He stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks that spiderwebbed across its surface, and wondered if this was the shape of his soul now. Fractured, unstable, waiting only for the weight of memory to bring it down entirely. The hours crept by, each one indistinguishable from the last. The oil in the lamp sputtered low, its light fading to a dim ember. Lot felt as though the night would never end, that the world itself had been caught in the pause between judgment and renewal, a timeless limbo where neither hope nor despair could fully take root. But in the faint light of early dawn, a thought, fragile, tenuous, began to form in the recesses of his mind. Perhaps this was not the end, not entirely. He had been spared, had he not? Though his hands were stained with compromise, though his heart bore the scars of too much silence, he still drew breath. Perhaps survival itself was a mercy undeserved, a gift extended not because of his righteousness, but because of another's. He turned his head toward his daughters, watching their chests rise and fall in the slow rhythm of sleep. If not for himself, then for them he must find a way forward. The path ahead was uncertain, but it led away from Sodom, away from the valley of ashes, and perhaps in time it might lead toward redemption. As the first weak rays of sunlight slipped through the cracks in the stone, Lot closed his eyes. Sleep came at last. Not the sleep of peace, but the heavy, dreamless slumber of a man too weary to carry his regrets any longer. Outside, the wind shifted again, scattering the last faint whispers of the valley into silence. The night air on the high ridge carried with it a chill that clung to Abraham's skin. But he did not feel it. He had remained there long after the sun's descent, long after the last colours had drained from the sky and the valley below had been swallowed by shadows. The faint glow of distant fires still flickered against the horizon, not the warm, life-giving glow of hearths or torches, but an angry, sullen light that pulsed and seethed, like a wound in the flesh of the earth. Abraham's eyes, weary yet unblinking, traced those faint red veins of light through the smoke that curled upward in slow, deliberate columns. He had stood vigil since the moment the Lord departed, his sandals rooted to the rocky earth, as if to abandon this place would be to betray it. Somewhere in that valley, beyond his sight, lay Sodom and Gomorrah, or what remained of them. The cities that once gleamed like jewels in the fertile plain now smouldered, their towers and gates consumed in a fire so total, so final, that no cry of survivor pierced the night. The silence was thick, oppressive. No wind stirred the grass at his feet. No birds sang from the darkened trees. Even the stars seemed muted, their light dulled by the haze that hung over the land. It was as though creation itself held its breath, recoiling from the judgment it had just witnessed. Abraham shifted his weight slightly, his knees stiff from the hours of standing, and let his hands clasp behind his back. His mind replayed, over and over, the words he had spoken to the Almighty. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. 45, 40, 20, 10. 10. Such a small number, and yet too large for Sodom to offer." His chest tightened with the thought, and for a moment he closed his eyes, pressing his palms together as if in prayer, though no words formed on his lips. His petitions had been bold, audacious even, yet met not with anger, but with a patience that had astonished him. The judge of all the earth had listened, had responded with a mercy so vast it might have spared thousands for the sake of a handful, and still it had not been enough. Abraham's thoughts turned to Lot, his nephew, his brother's son, the boy he had watched grow into a man. Was he still alive? Had he heeded the warnings of those strangers, or had he perished with the others, clinging to the comforts of a city that had turned its back on all that was good? Abraham could not know. He could only pray that somewhere in that valley of smoke and ash, one righteous soul had found a path to safety. The faint light of the fires seemed to shift as he watched, their glow receding ever so slightly as though the very earth was sealing the wounds left by divine wrath. Abraham's breath came slow and shallow, each exhale a cloud in the cool night air. He wondered, not for the first time, if he should have pressed further, if he should have asked for 5, for 3, for even one righteous soul to be enough. Would the Almighty have relented? Or was the rot so deep that not even one remained unsullied? But then, in the depths of his heart, a quiet conviction stirred. The God he had spoken with was not a capricious destroyer. He had lingered in conversation, had allowed a mortal man to speak, to plead, to wrestle with the weight of justice and mercy. Abraham realized with a dawning clarity that the outcome was never about numbers, but about hearts. 10 righteous would have saved the cities, but there had not been 10 because there had not been hearts willing to turn back. The wind shifted slightly then, carrying to his nostrils the acrid scent of sulfur. It stung his eyes, made him blink, but he did not turn away. He stood rooted, a solitary figure against the vast darkness, and let the reality of what had been done settle deep into his bones. There was a lesson here, one too vast to grasp all at once, yet he felt its edges pressing against his soul. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? The words rose unbidden in his mind, not as a question this time, but as an affirmation. Yes. Though the cities burned, though the valley lay desolate, the hand that had wrought such destruction was not unjust. It was the hand of a creator grieving over his creation, the hand of a father whose patience, though long, was not infinite. Abraham sank slowly to his knees, the rough stones biting into his flesh, and bowed his head. He prayed, not for Sodom, whose fate was sealed, but for the generations yet to come, that they might remember and choose differently. He prayed for Lot, wherever he might be. He prayed for himself, for the courage to continue walking the path set before him. And as the first faint blush of dawn began to stain the eastern sky, Abraham rose. The smoke still lingered, but its glow had dimmed. The fires had done their work, and now the earth waited, silent and still, for what would come after. With slow, deliberate steps, Abraham turned away from the ridge. Behind him, the valley of judgment lay shrouded in morning mist, its scars hidden but not healed. Ahead of him stretched the hills of Mamre, the oaks standing tall against the lightning sky. And in his heart, heavy yet steadfast, he carried the memory of a night spent watching, a night spent pleading, a night spent learning the terrible weight of divine justice. The valley lay still beneath the pale light of morning, its silence vast and suffocating. Here, where once laughter rang from market squares, and the air was thick with the scent of spices and bread, now there was only the acrid bite of ash carried on a restless wind. The smoke lingered low over the ruins, curling in sluggish spirals that clung to the blackened earth as though reluctant to release their hold. It was not the smoke of life, no cook fires, no torches, but the bitter remnants of a judgment so complete, it seemed to have scorched even the memory of the cities from the living world. The ground was cracked and brittle. The soil turned to a grey crust that crumbled beneath the faintest weight. Charred husks of trees jutted from the earth, like skeletal fingers, reaching skyward in silent lament. Rivers that once danced silver through fertile fields now lay stagnant and choked with black debris, their surfaces shimmering faintly with an oily sheen that reflected the lifeless sky above. Birds circled far overhead, but dared not descend, their cries sharp and anxious before they wheeled away to safer lands. Here and there, remnants of walls could still be seen. Shattered stones blackened by heat, twisted beams half sunken in the dust. They offered no shelter, no trace of the lives once sheltered within them. What had been palaces and homes were now indistinguishable mounds, their outlines blurred, as though the hand of an unseen artist had smeared them into oblivion. The plain itself seemed altered, its contours subtly shifted, as though the earth had heaved and settled under the weight of divine fury. In places, the soil was encrusted with salt deposits, glittering faintly in the wan light. They formed strange, crystalline shapes that caught the eye and held it. A frozen wave here, a cluster of jagged spires there, and on the edges of sight, what might have been pillars standing sentinel against the empty horizon. It was said later by those who dared approach that the air tasted of bitterness, that a single inhalation left a dryness in the throat, as if even breath recoiled from such a place. Animals avoided the valley's edge, their tracks veering sharply away as though guided by some ancient instinct. Travellers told of strange sounds carried on the wind, whispers too faint to make out yet laced with a sorrow so deep it seemed to seep into their bones. There was no movement now, not even the restless stirring of insects or the scurrying of small creatures. It was as though life itself had withdrawn, leaving only the echo of what once was. The valley had become a monument to absence, a void where abundance had turned to ruin, where human voices had been replaced by the soft hiss of wind through scorched reeds. And yet, in that silence there was a story etched into every grain of ash, every shattered stone, every salted pool where fish had once leapt. It was not merely the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, but of humanity itself, of pride swelling unchecked, of hospitality forsaken, of justice perverted, until the cries of the innocent rose louder than the songs of revelry. The whispers of ancient prophets seemed to stir from the dust. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom, pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but she did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abomination before me. The valley bore witness, its silence louder than any voice, its desolation a mirror held up to every generation that would come after. It asked a question not with words, but with its very being. How many more cities must be consumed before the lesson was learned? To the east, the faint outlines of the Dead Sea glimmered in the distance, its waters heavy and still, a body of water so dense with salt that nothing could live within. Travellers in centuries to come would call it cursed, whispering of the fire that once rained from heaven, of cities swallowed whole by the wrath of God. They would gaze across its lifeless expanse and shudder, sensing that some remnant of that ancient judgment still slept beneath its surface. But in this moment, the valley remained unvisited, unseen, save by the eyes of heaven. It waited, as all things wait after destruction, for the slow creep of time to soften its scars, for wind and rain to shape its contours anew, for memory itself to fade. Yet perhaps this was its purpose, not to heal, not to forget, but to endure as a witness, a silent sentinel against the arrogance of man. Somewhere, far above the drifting smoke, sunlight broke through a gap in the clouds, casting a thin beam of gold upon the wasteland. It illuminated a solitary formation, a jagged pillar of salt standing at the edge of the ruin. To the unknowing, it was but another oddity of geology. But to those who remembered, it was more. It was a warning carved in crystal, a reminder of a heart turned backward, even as salvation beckoned forward. The wind shifted, stirring a small flurry of ash into the air, and for a moment the valley seemed almost to sigh. Lot walked ahead of his daughters, his shoulders hunched under the weight of silence. They had spoken little since leaving Zoar. Words felt foreign, fragile things that might shatter if spoken aloud in the presence of such vast and terrible emptiness. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath their feet, and the occasional whistle of wind threading through jagged rocks. And then they saw her. It began as a pale glint on the periphery of vision, a shimmer that caught the corner of Lot's eye and drew it inexorably, despite his better judgment. He froze mid-step, his breath catching in his throat as he turned his gaze, just slightly, toward the barren plain below. There she stood, her form unmistakable even in its transformation. The pillar rose from the earth, slender yet resolute, crystalline facets catching the morning light and scattering it in sharp, prismatic flashes. From a distance, it might have been mistaken for an oddly shaped stalagmite or a freak of mineral formation, but Lot knew. Every line, every curve was burned into his memory. The slope of her shoulders, the delicate arch of her neck, the way her hair had once fallen in soft waves now frozen as jagged ridges of salt. The wind blew across the plain, stirring faint whispers in the air, and for a fleeting moment he thought he heard her voice, soft, pleading, filled with longing. But it was only the echo of memory, cruel in its clarity. He wanted to move toward her, to close the distance and reach out, to press his palm against the cold, crystalline surface and feel some remnant of warmth, some trace of the woman who had shared his bed, his table, his life. His feet shifted involuntarily, but he stopped himself, his body trembling with the effort. The warning of the angels resounded in his mind like a bell tolling in the darkness. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. But was this truly looking back, or was it simply honoring what once was? His daughters, sensing his hesitation, drew closer. They kept their eyes fixed ahead, their expressions taut with fear and grief. To them, this was no place to linger, no place for remembrance. It was a border, a line they dared not cross, lest the same fate claim them. Lot forced himself to turn away. His voice, hoarse and barely more than a whisper, escaped his cracked lips. She belongs to the city now, and I must belong to the hills. The words tasted like ash. He pressed onward, his feet heavy, his chest tight with the ache of things left unsaid. Behind him, the pillar caught the sunlight one last time, before the path curved and it slipped from view. The air seemed to grow lighter as they climbed higher, but in Lot's heart, a stone remained, cold and immovable. And so they walked on, 3 figures climbing away from a past crystallized in salt, toward a future as uncertain as the barren hills that awaited them.